Week 8 of the NFL season is officially in the books. We saw some massive upsets involving some of the top teams in the league, game-winning touchdowns, and some big names making a return to action. Welcome to American Baller, where we focus on all things NFL. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell for future videos. Today, we're set to break it all down, giving you a crash course of all 16 matchups from the week. Minnesota Vikings vs. Los Angeles Rams. Week 8 kicked off with a Thursday night matchup between the Minnesota Vikings and Los Angeles Rams. After suffering their first loss of the season last week, the Vikings were dead set on bouncing back this week and not letting their losing skid continue. On the other side of the field, the Rams saw the return of their two stars at the wide receiver position in Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. This was a very hard-fought game by two teams that have a chance of meeting again in the postseason. As always, Justin Jefferson did his thing for Minnesota, pulling in 8 passes for 115 yards. However, the player of the game has to go to Stafford, who absolutely showed out with his receiving corps back at full force. He finished the contest with 279 yards and 4 touchdowns through the air while leading the Rams to a 30-20 win. LA improves to 3-4 while the losing streak continues for the Vikings, who currently sit at 5-2 on the year. Green Bay Packers vs. Jacksonville Jaguars. Now we move on to the 1 o'clock Sunday slate, beginning with the game between the Green Bay Packers and Jacksonville Jaguars. These two teams couldn't have had more different starts to the season, with the Packers entering the matchup with a record of 5-2, while the Jags have struggled to a 2-5 record. However, this wound up being a very tight game that came down to the wire. The Packers suffered a tough loss, with quarterback Jordan Love going down with a groin injury that forced him to leave the game early and could keep him sidelined for a couple weeks. With their starting quarterback out, the Packers heavily leaned on their run game, and Josh Jacobs was there to pick up the slack, finishing the contest with 127 yards and a pair of touchdowns on the ground. On the other side, Trevor Lawrence had a very respectable showing, throwing for 308 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick. However, even with this strong day through the air, it was not enough to bring the Jags a win. Green Bay came out on top by a final score of 30-27, improving their record to 6-2, while Jacksonville fell to 2-6. Arizona Cardinals vs. Miami Dolphins. Next up, we have the Arizona Cardinals and the Miami Dolphins. This has been a very rough season for the Dolphins, with Tua Tagovailoa missing a good chunk of the year with a concussion. However, he made a return to action this week in an attempt to turn the year around for Miami. He had a bit of a disappointing return, throwing for 234 yards and a touchdown. However, with Tua back in the lineup, Devon Achane came back to life, picking up a collective 169 all-purpose yards along with the receiving touchdown. However, Tagovailoa was outclassed by Kyler Murray, who went for 307 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. The two main beneficiaries of this strong passing day from Murray were tight end Trey McBride and rookie wide receiver Marvin Harrison Jr. McBride pulled in 9 passes for 124 yards, being one of many at his position who showed out for National Tight End Day. Despite being guarded by Jalen Ramsey for most of the game, Harrison Jr. recorded 6 catches for 111 yards and a touchdown. This was another game that came down to the wire, with the Cardinals coming out on top by a final score of 28-27. They currently sit at 4-4, while another loss drags the Dolphins down to 2-6. New York Jets vs. New England Patriots. Let's move on to the New York Jets and New England Patriots. This was set to be a get-right game for the Jets, who have had a horrendous start to the year, getting off to a 2-5 start in what may be the final year of Aaron Rodgers' career. Rodgers' connection with former Green Bay Packers teammate Davante Adams has still left a lot to be desired, with Adams finishing the game with only 4 catches for 54 yards. Garrett Wilson has continued to be the wide receiver 1, going for 5 catches and 113 yards. However, the story of the game is the Patriots getting things done on the ground. Ramondre Stevenson finished the day with 48 yards and a pair of touchdowns. Along with this, rookie quarterback Drake May picked up a rushing touchdown of his own before suffering a concussion that knocked him out of the game. Despite missing their starting QB, the Pats came out on top by a final score of 25-22. Both teams now sit at 2-6 on the year. Baltimore Ravens vs. Cleveland Browns. Now we'll move on to an AFC North matchup between the Baltimore Ravens and Cleveland Browns. This was Cleveland's first matchup without Deshaun Watson at the starting quarterback position after he went down with a torn Achilles last week. Jameis Winston stepped up in his absence, throwing for an elite 334 yards and 3 touchdowns. The backfield duo of Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry played at a very high level, with Jackson throwing for 289 yards and 2 touchdowns, while Henry rushed for 73 yards and a touchdown. Cleveland suffered some major losses to their defense, with cornerback Denzel Ward suffering a concussion and linebacker Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah being carted off the field and hospitalized with a neck injury. Winston pulled off some late-game heroics and with a minute left in the game found Cedric Tillman for a go-ahead 39-yard touchdown to give Cleveland the lead. The Browns came out on top by a final score of 29-24 in what was arguably the biggest upset of the week. With this win, the Browns improved to 2-6, while the Ravens are still in good shape at 5-3. Philadelphia Eagles vs. Cincinnati Bengals. Let's jump to the matchup between the Philadelphia Eagles and Cincinnati Bengals. Despite being considered Super Bowl contenders heading into the season, the Bengals have gotten off to a rough start this season, and things didn't improve for them in Week 8. Joe Burrow played well below his standards, throwing for 234 yards, a touchdown, and a pick. On the other side, Jalen Hurts stole the show, throwing for 236 yards and a touchdown while completing 16 of his 20 passing attempts. Along with this, he found the end zone 3 times on the ground. This wasn't much of a game, with the Eagles winning by a final score of 37-17. They now sit at 5-2, while the hole the Bengals have dug for themselves continues to get deeper, with their record now being 3-5. If things don't turn around quickly for them, there's a strong chance that they miss the playoffs. Indianapolis Colts vs. Houston Texans. Now we'll look at an AFC South matchup where the Indianapolis Colts took on the Houston Texans. Running back Jonathan Taylor made a return for the Colts and showed out in his comeback, rushing for 105 yards and a touchdown. However, quarterback Anthony Richardson had a very underwhelming day, throwing for 175 yards, a touchdown, and a pick. On the other side, CJ Stroud had a good bounce-back performance, throwing for 285 yards and a touchdown after a terrible Week 7 against the Packers last week. Joe Mixon had a great day on the ground for Houston, picking up 102 yards and finding the end zone once. While the Texans were able to come out on top 23-20, they did suffer a big loss of their wide receiver Stephon Diggs, who suffered a knee injury. It's still unclear if his injury will force him to miss some serious time. With this win, the Texans improved to 6-2, while the Colts sit at 4-4. Tennessee Titans vs. Detroit Lions. Now let's take a look at the matchup between the Detroit Lions and Tennessee Titans. Coming into this game, no one really thought that it was going to be close, but no one could have seen what the Lions offense had in store coming. Despite only throwing for 85 yards, Jared Goff still finished the day with 3 passing touchdowns. However, he was not the only Lion to throw for a touchdown, with running back David Montgomery also throwing a 3-yard touchdown along with finding the end zone on the ground. Jahmyr Gibbs also had an elite day on the ground, rushing for 127 yards and a touchdown. There isn't much positive to say about the Titans in this game, as they were demolished in embarrassing fashion by a final score of 52-14. This likely will be the lowest point of the year for Tennessee and what will continue to be a rough season. They now sit at 1-6, while the Lions are 6-1 and looking like one of the top teams in the entire NFC. Atlanta Falcons vs. Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We move on to an NFC South matchup between the Atlanta Falcons and Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Heading into this matchup, no one knew how Tampa Bay's offense would look with both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin sidelined with injuries. However, Baker Mayfield rose to the occasion, throwing for 330 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 picks. These 2 interceptions went on to make a huge difference in this matchup. On the other side, Kirk Cousins had an incredible game, throwing for 276 yards and 4 touchdowns. Tight end Kyle Pitts had his best game of the season, pulling in 4 passes for 91 yards and 2 touchdowns. Despite the great day from the Falcons through the air, this was still a contest that came down to the wire, with them narrowly escaping by a final score of 31-26. Atlanta improves their record to 5-3 with this win, while the Bucs fall to 4-4. New Orleans Saints vs. Los Angeles Chargers. For the final game in the 1 o'clock slate, the New Orleans Saints took on the Los Angeles Chargers. Since Derek Carr went down with an injury, the Saints have greatly struggled with Spencer Rattler under center. This continued in Week 8, where New Orleans was only able to muster 8 points. Along with this, 2 of their big playmakers in Chris Olave and Marshawn Lattimore were forced to leave the game early with injuries. Justin Herbert had a very solid performance through the air, throwing for 279 yards and a pair of touchdowns. The main beneficiary of this was Ladd McConkey, who had an elite showing, pulling in 6 passes for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns. LA came out on top by a final score of 26-8, improving their record to 4-3 while the Saints fall to 2-6. Buffalo Bills vs Seattle Seahawks. Kicking off the 4 o'clock games, we'll look at the Buffalo Bills and Seattle Seahawks game. Without DK Metcalf in the lineup, the Seahawks passing game greatly struggled. Geno Smith finished the game with 212 yards and a pick. Along with this, the Bills held Kenneth Walker III in check, allowing him to pick up only 12 yards on 9 carries. On offense, Buffalo couldn't be stopped. Josh Allen threw for 283 yards, 2 touchdowns and a pick, while James Cook picked up 111 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. This was not much of a game, and Buffalo continues to look like true contenders to win the AFC this season. They came out on top by a final score of 31-10, improving to 6-2 on the year, while Seattle dropped to 4-4. Chicago Bears vs Washington Commanders. Next up is the Chicago Bears and the Washington Commanders. This was one of, if not the best game of the week between the first and second overall pick of the 2024 NFL Draft. However, Jaden Daniels proved why the Bears might have made a mistake passing on him with the first overall pick. He finished the game with 326 yards and a touchdown to Williams' 131 yards through the air. The play of the game came with only 2 seconds left in regulation. Down by 3 points on the Bears side of the field, Daniels threw a Hail Mary that bounced off of a Chicago defender and into the hands of Devin Brown. This is arguably the best play so far this season and gave the Commanders the game by a final score of 18-15. They've been the biggest surprise so far this year, now sitting at 6-2 while the Bears go to 4-3 with the loss. Kansas City Chiefs vs Las Vegas Raiders. Now we jump to an AFC West matchup between the Kansas City Chiefs and Las Vegas Raiders. This is a game that almost no one had high expectations for, and many believed this would be another easy win for the Chiefs. However, the Raiders kept things interesting, only falling by a final score of 27-20. Mahomes had a solid day, throwing for 262 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 pick. Travis Kelce showed out on National Tight End Day, pulling in 90 yards and a touchdown. This was his first receiving touchdown in 13 regular season games. For the Raiders, Gardner Minshew II played a clean game, throwing for 209 yards and 2 touchdowns. However, it wasn't enough with the Raiders falling 27-20. The Chiefs remained perfect with a record of 7-0 while Las Vegas falls to 2-6. Carolina Panthers vs Denver Broncos. Rounding out the 4 o'clock games is the Carolina Panthers and Denver Broncos. Bryce Young made a return as the Panthers starter in this matchup. He had a roller coaster of a game, throwing for 224 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 picks. Thus far, the Broncos have had one of, if not the best defense in the entire league, so all things considered, this could have gone much worse for Young. For Denver, rookie QB Bo Nix had arguably the best game of his career thus far, throwing for 284 yards and 3 touchdowns. The Broncos came out on top by a final score of 28-14, improving to 5-3, while Carolina sits at 1-7 and contenders for the first overall pick in the 2025 draft. Dallas Cowboys vs San Francisco 49ers. In the Sunday night matchup, the Dallas Cowboys took on the San Francisco 49ers. Despite their records, this was a matchup between 2 of the most talented teams in the NFC and a must-win game for the 49ers, who have dug quite a hole for themselves early in the season. Dak Prescott was all over the place in this matchup, throwing for 243 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a pair of picks. This inconsistency wound up being devastating for the Cowboys. In comparison, while Purdy didn't light up the stat sheet by any means, he threw for 260 yards and a touchdown, along with picking up a score on the ground. Isaac Guerendo stole the show at the running back position, rushing for 85 yards and a score. It was only fitting that Kittle showed out on National Tight End Day, pulling in 6 passes for 128 yards and a touchdown. The 49ers came out on top by a final score of 30-24, jumping to 4-4, while the Cowboys now have a losing record of 3-4. Both of these teams need to wake up before they're completely out of the hunt of making the playoffs. New York Giants vs. Pittsburgh Steelers. On Monday night, the New York Giants took on the Pittsburgh Steelers. This wound up being a much closer contest than many could have expected coming into the game. The Giants were led offensively by running back Tyrone Tracy Jr., who posted 145 yards and a touchdown on the ground, while Russell Wilson had a solid day at the office, throwing for 278 yards and a touchdown. While Steelers running back Najee Harris was unable to find the end zone, he had a very strong showing, rushing for 114 yards. Once again, the Steelers' defense came up huge, holding New York to only 18 points. Pittsburgh came out on top by a final score of 26-18, improving their record to 6-2, while the Giants slid to 2-6. Top performers. It seems only right that George Kittle comes in as the top performer of the week. With it being National Tight Ends Day, he absolutely showed out for 128 yards and a touchdown on 6 catches. Without him on the field, there is no chance that the 49ers would have come out on top over the Cowboys. Some other players that deserve some recognition are Jameis Winston, who not only led the league with 334 yards, but also threw a game-winning touchdown pass late in the 4th quarter. Despite suffering a loss, Tyrone Tracy Jr. led the league in rushing yards with 145. CeeDee Lamb fell in a similar boat. While the Cowboys fell short to the 49ers, he still torched their secondary for 146 yards. Finally, leading the league in tackles on the defensive side of the ball is Ernest Jones IV of the Seattle Seahawks. MVP Power Rankings. Now we'll take a look at the MVP Power Ranking following Week 8. These 4 players currently have the best odds to take home the award according to betting odds from BetMGM. Coming in at the top spot is Lamar Jackson. Despite Jackson and the Ravens being upset by the Browns, he still had a very solid showing, and it was clear that the loss was not his fault. He currently has amassed 2,099 yards and 17 touchdowns while throwing only 2 picks. Along with this, he's picked up an additional 501 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. In second place is Josh Allen. Allen led the Bills to a huge win over the Seahawks, and he had an incredible game. He threw a pick in this contest, but it was only his first interception of the year. Along with greatly cutting down on the turnovers, Allen has also thrown for 1,766 yards and 14 touchdowns on the year, while rushing for 204 yards and 3 touchdowns. At third place is Patrick Mahomes. Despite this arguably being the worst season statistically of his career, Mahomes has led the Chiefs to an undefeated 7-0 record. Currently, he's thrown for 1,651 yards, 8 touchdowns, and leads the league with 9 interceptions. Along with this, he's run for 139 yards and a touchdown. Even if Mahomes keeps playing like this, if the Chiefs finish the season undefeated, there's a strong chance that he still takes home the award. Rounding out the top 4 is Jared Goff. Despite only throwing for 85 yards in the Lions' 52-point outburst, he still threw for 3 touchdowns. This season, he's recorded 1,695 yards, 13 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions, while leading the league with a completion percentage of 74.1%. Time will tell who winds up taking home the award when things are all said and done. However, for the time being, it appears to realistically be a 2-man race between Jackson and Allen. Thank you for tuning in to American Baller. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell for future videos.